So welcome to this week's Iowa Learning Farms webinar. Sorry if you uh, had logged in last week to hear from Katie Densman from Iowa State University. Unfortunately, she was ill. That's the first time we've had that in all of our Iowa Learning Farms webinars. So I guess we've been fortunate that hasn't happened more often, especially with all the COVID issues and such. So we are working to reschedule that, or Elena, more explicitly, Elena is working to reschedule that. So definitely be on the lookout for when that's rescheduled, probably in 2024, but I don't know that with 100% certainty. But this week we are really fortunate to have Matt Leavitt with University of Minnesota to talk to us about perennial and winter annual crops for economic and environmental benefit. And so I think that, for a lot of us, the more we can have green cover on the land, the better. And so talking about the perennial and winter annual crops have that potential. I'm really excited to hear about some of the work that's been going on in Minnesota with this. As always, if you have questions, please type those in the chat box and we'll get those to Matt at the end of his talk. And with that, Matt, the virtual floor is all yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. And hey, everybody. Glad to be here as part of your program. If at all, if you have questions throughout as I'm going through things, please feel free to just interrupt me as I'm going on here. But as Matt said, I'm the agronomist for the University of Minnesota Forever Green Initiative. And just to kind of level set a little bit, I'll give you a little background on what we're doing and what we're up to at the Forever Green Initiative, and then kind of do a very surface level overview of some of the crops we're working with kind of in the state of Minnesota and throughout the upper Midwest. Certainly, I'm not going to get into kind of the nitty gritty of all these crops, but more than happy to answer questions as they come up, either today or down the road if you're viewing this at a later time. So just to kind of give a little background here, I'm pretty sure I'm not telling anybody anything they don't already know about agriculture in the upper Midwest, but we kind of go through cycles of very little perennial or green cover on the landscape. And that mainly has a function to do of how we're utilizing our landscape for agriculture. So we get, a peak of both solar radiation and precipitation throughout the growing season. That's really only being captured about, 3 to 4 months out of the year. And the remainder of that season, and kind of a shoulder season, so to speak, in spring and in fall, are bare. And that, opens up our agricultural landscapes to some of the issues that we see of, nutrients leaving the landscape, soil quality metrics declining over time. Mainly because those soils are not being protected and actively built upon when there's not green and growing crops out there kind of in the height of the season. So if we took a satellite photo throughout the, from a bird's eye view of what the landscape looks like in the upper Midwest, we would see in April, we're, more or less fairly brown. In May, when we start to have the crops up and growing, we're kind of utilizing more of that solar radiation. The corn and soybeans that are out there and predominantly across the landscape are up and growing and really sucking up a lot of that, the moisture and the nutrients, and, doing a really good job at growing the crops that we export around to the world, kind of peaking into that July, August timeframe. But once we get to the tail end of the season, there again, right about now, we're brown again. And, this really leads to a lot of the issues that we're dealing with all across the upper Midwest. Certainly you folks in Iowa are well aware of this, that, in those moments where, the soil is not covered, it leaves the soil bare to erosion. We're losing nutrients and soil down the Mississippi River. That's creating the Gulf of Mexico hypoxia zone. And also kind of on a more human health perspective, those nutrients and those nitrates can end up in our rural and city water systems as a really big problem. So that those materials, are leaky, they leave the landscape attached to water. And that's mainly a function of, crops not being there on the landscape to utilize those nutrients. And that's really kind of the, setting the stage of why I have the role I do with the University of Minnesota Forever Green, and why we're really trying to address these ecosystem service components of crops that will grow and provide perennial cover 365, but also not only as a cover crop, but provide some sort of economic benefit at the back end as well. And we can really see this kind of in a, A and B photo. The top photo is, a typical fall tilled field following a 1-inch rainfall. This is right on campus here on St. Paul. On the left, which would be a traditional, system in the upper Midwest after, corn is done growing, et cetera. We still have folks that do fall tillage. On the right-hand side, we have intermediate wheatgrass, or a crop that some of you may have been familiar with called kernza, which is a perennial grain crop. It's, basically an improved variety of intermediate wheatgrass that roots down very far, up to 10 feet, and provides, both biomass for forage harvest, but also provides grain to harvest as well. And you can see it's just a night and day difference of, soil coverage, nitrogen utilization. It's locking up moisture, it's building soil. So that's really the goal of what we're trying to address, and also where we're trying to direct kind of our breeding and development efforts across the upper Midwest. Similar story there on the bottom. You have a field on the left that's kind of a typical pre-plant agricultural field, before you plant corn or soybeans. And on the right, you have a field of winter camelina, which is like canola. It's in the Brassica family, and it produces, it's a winter annual. So you plant it in the fall, it would overwinter and grow in the spring, and flower and produce small oil seeds that can be harvested for cover crop use. And they're increasingly being more sought after for a biofuel end use as well. So, there again, it's those shoulder seasons that are often the real big concern here, where there's no or limited cover on the landscape, and that soil is bare and prone to, erosion and nutrient loss. And so that's really where we're trying to direct our breeding and development efforts on the bottom. So you can see a field on the bottom right with winter camelina would, keep those nutrients locked in place, utilize the moisture that's coming down, prevent, those kind of pounding rains that can crust over the soil, prevent infiltration, et cetera. So these benefits are multifaceted when you're talking about incorporating perennial cover or winter annual cover in the landscape. So, overall, the Forever Green Initiative is kind of a nested research and development effort, both on the breeding end. So taking all these new and novel crops that we're working with and, breeding for advantageous agronomic traits, making them more competitive with crops that folks might be interested in growing on the landscape, but also taking those efforts and commercializing them as well. And that's really been the missing link historically when you're talking about, new and novel crops from the research kind of world, is that they do a lot of great benefit, but they don't have a lot of kind of that economic pull that, large scale CPG companies, fuel oil companies are really looking for, to really create that landscape level change that we're so hoping for to address these concerns. So that's really where it ties both of those pieces together. So it's breeding and commercialization on the back end to really create landscape level change. And our focus is on winter annual and perennial crops. Again, continuous living cover is really the byline there. So we're hoping to have, perennial green and growing crops on the landscape to really address those concerns. And, they're providing new economic opportunities too. So cover crops are great. You've probably heard a lot about those. And really we're talking about just adding another level of benefit over what a cover crop might provide to a farming system, all the same ecosystem service benefits, but also providing some sort of economic return on the back end. So it's a cover crop with a harvestable element is this essentially the goal there. And, that's part of our breeding and commercialization work is also kind of identifying those new and novel crops that have, a food product use, identifying all these different, end uses for these crops to really, again, help that pull through the marketplace and provide economic opportunity for folks in rural landscapes too. So it's about the human component as well. We're talking about, overall landscape level change. It's trickling down to the people that actually operate the land too, and giving them a third, in some cases, a third option beyond corn and soybeans to really, address environmental concerns, but also, to give them some new marketable, harvestable crops to produce as well. And the environmental services piece is really where kind of I come into this picture as well. And I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But these are not benefits that are probably new to anybody that works with either NRCS, kind of soil health components. A lot of these are fairly well understood benefits of cover cropping systems as well, with the ultimate goal of really focusing on water quality. That's kind of our lens, so to speak, of environmental services. But obviously they, a lot of these crops provide other benefits as well, including keeping soil in place, building soil, sequestering carbon, providing forage for bees and butterflies and other pollinators. So it's multifaceted. And, there's been a recent report that's been done by one of our partners on the landscape, which is Great River Greening and some other partners that we've had, that under medium adoption kind of scenarios where we can kind of future prognosticate people deploying these crops in the landscape, we can see reduced nitrogen loss by up to 20 to 25%. Soil erosion can be reduced by about 35%. Greenhouse gas emissions can decline, and overall farm revenues can increase too when there's a diversity of crops in the landscape, which also offers concurrent benefits for growers too, to diversify their cropping systems as well. So a lot of benefits to be discussed. And in terms of our overall cropping systems, I'm only going to touch on a few of the crops in our portfolio. Our entire portfolio is made up of about 16 different crops, and it continues to grow and change as time goes on here. But I'm going to kind of focus on one perennial and a couple winter annuals from our portfolio, just to give you a sense of, which ones are kind of on the cusp of development and which ones are already being planted and deployed on the landscape. So the first crop I'll highlight is winter barley, which we do have a breeding effort at the University of Minnesota to make this crop more viable in the upper Midwest. Kind of the biggest limitation with winter barley has always been its winter hardiness. So, winter annual cereal grains fit our production system really well. They can often be planted in the fall, depending on what crop is in rotation. You could plant it after say an early soybean, silage corn, dry edible beans, canning crops, small grains, things like that. And it will confer all those same benefits. So it'll cover the soil in the fall and in the spring, where we receive the majority of our precipitation, keep that soil in place, keep those nutrients locked in place. And, a really nice thing, attribute of winter barley is that it matures really early. So as a cereal grain, it provides, a pretty good window to plant a summer annual crop after, like an early soybean, or, maybe other summer annual crops too, like a sunflower or a buckwheat, after the winter barley would come off. So it's very early to mature. And it just like spring barley, which has a lot of uptake in, say, the malting brewing industry, it's really great as a livestock feed. There is a smaller human food market for it as well. The winter barley would confer the same types of benefits, except that often winter barley has higher yields. One of the devils of spring barley is disease pressure. That's why a lot of the production is moved farther west, where it's drier and they just have less precipitation and fungal disease issues. But winter barley can kind of mature and kind of avoid some of those issues. Inputs are much lower with winter barley, and it's very competitive with weeds. So it's, again, kind of taking over that ecosystem service benefit of covering the soil in the fall and early winter, but also providing a harvestable grain at the back end. There's a difference between breeding efforts on kind of 2-row and 6-row barley. It's kind of more from an academic perspective. A lot of the breeding efforts at the University of Minnesota were really focused on 6-row barley because that's what the big maltsters and brewers wanted back in the day. But that's kind of changed in recent times. 2-row barleys have kind of taken over the malting and brewing industry writ large. And, you know, the biggest limitation to making winter barley more viable in the upper Midwest is just making sure we're selecting for varieties that have good winter hardiness. And that's really been the focus of the breeding efforts here. And as of 2 years ago, the University of Minnesota did release a facultative winter barley with excellent winter hardiness for the upper Midwest. So that's called MN Equinox. And that's available as of right now. And it's facultative, meaning it can be planted in the fall or the spring and still produce viable grain. So it gives, additionally, gives producers kind of a wider window in case, you know, things don't work out, or on the seed production end of things, you know, if experience winter kill or the crop fails for whatever reason in the fall, you can replant it in the spring as well and kind of take advantage of that dual use potential there. And there's lots of kind of market pull on barley. The biggest thing is kind of on the commercialization end is inquiring with folks that malt barley. So thinking of like raw malting and other entities like that are already positioned in the Midwest, but, you know, truthfully don't buy a lot of barley in our region just because there's not a lot of barley being produced right now. It's, you know, mainly being sourced from Canada and farther west. So we're trying to kind of move that production back closer to a lot of where that infrastructure started. Livestock feed, there's a really big pull there. If we can get barley more kind of integrated into the livestock feed market, it feeds very similarly to corn. Doesn't have the energy, but it has a very similar nutrient profile. So it's very desirable from that standpoint. And there's also, you know, forage and straw markets. In fact, there's an innovative producer in southwestern Wisconsin that has found a really viable market for winter barley as a pet litter. So, I mean, if you're willing to be innovative and kind of be at the cutting edge of some of these markets, you can really find pretty interesting uses for some of these crops. And this just kind of gives you a really nice visual of what we're trying to achieve and why a winter annual apples to apples would, you know, not only provide, you know, decent pocketbook returns for farmers, which typically, you know, winter seeded cereals tend to yield more than spring seeded cereals. Inputs tend to be about the same or a little bit lower, but, you know, the picture tells the story. So on the left is a fall planted winter barley. On the right is a spring planted winter barley. And if you get a really driving, hard pounding rain, you know, that field on the left is going to be able to withstand that and provide a net benefit to that farming system versus the crop on the right. It's just holding that soil in place. The crop is that much more established. It's going to mature earlier. It's going to utilize those nutrients, make sure they're not leaving the system, and, you know, provide both economic and ecosystem returns for that farming system. Next one I'll highlight is hybrid winter rye. You know, so I'm sure most of you are familiar with just standard you know, open pollinated winter rye that you'd grow on a farm for cover crop seed or for forage, et cetera. It's kind of the same principle, except that hybrid winter rye has actually been selected and hybridized and bred specifically for beneficial agronomic traits, but also extremely high yield. So it's a similar phenomenon about what's happened with corn historically. So we had OP corn for, you know, hundreds of years, and then hybrid corn came on the marketplace. The hybrids were stood a lot better. They yielded more. You could push the population up. So agronomic characteristics were far superior to OP. And this is definitely the case with hybrid rye, but it is protected. So all the genetics are owned by private companies currently. So we at the University of Minnesota don't do any breeding on hybrid rye specifically, but it's kind of part of our portfolio in that it's accomplishing those same goals on the landscape that all of those other winter annuals are bringing. And it's bringing higher yields, again, lower disease with things like ergot and fungal disease. It stands better. It has a better agronomic profile and really good grain quality as a result as well. Again, kind of plugging that soil hole in the fall and the spring. So in the shoulder seasons, it's covering the ground. It does have a higher cost of production versus OP winter rye, but you're gaining a lot of benefit on the back end there too. You might be able to hear my dog there in the background. Hopefully it's not disturbing people. And there's a lot of market uses for winter rye as well. Now, in certain countries where rye is very well established, in the EU, in Canada, rye is used routinely as a livestock feed, and that really kind of drives the whole system. There is a decent market in the US right now for distilling to make rye whiskey and stuff like that kind of powers a lot of the production, at least in the state of Minnesota. But if we could get rye into livestock feed, that pool of available grain is just a whole lot bigger, and it's not specialized, in terms of other kind of value-added markets like for food or for, other drinking uses, beverage uses, et cetera. So that's really something we're trying to actively work on is winter rye utilization, especially in the pork industry. So rye has very beneficial health benefits to swine. It can lead to nice fat marbling that makes the pork very desirable for export, and also kind of on the domestic market as well. So that's really where we're trying to focus kind of our commercialization efforts writ large, because hybrid rye, agronomically speaking, is a really good fit for folks that have that open window for seeding. And it's not a great fit after, full season corn, but if you raise, shorter season soybeans, again, small grain, silage corn, things like that allow you to plant it by, October, early to mid-October, that can really give you, a viable window to get this established. And there's also, markets for forage. There's forage specific varieties of hybrid rye, and the straw is very valuable as well. Increasingly in places where there's livestock in the landscape, sometimes straw is hard to find, and hybrid rye yields a lot of straw. And this just kind of gives you a good visual of, the yield differences between a hybrid rye and like a traditional OP. So this is yield data results from University of Minnesota replicated yield trials. And, basically, if you just look at the average, which is probably the most important column here, you can see the difference between a variety like, Danko or Elbon or Hazlitt, which are all open pollinated varieties, versus anything with KWS that I've highlighted in green, or SU at the bottom, are all hybrids. So there's a significant yield increase between hybrids versus OPs. And really we're seeing, very good uptake with growers based on that alone. Lower disease, higher yield is it works very well for folks that have rye in their rotation. And I do see a question on here, so I'll just kind of take that.
We can wait till the end, Matt.
Oh, okay.
We'll get them all at the end. Yep.
Gotcha. All right. Yep. So we'll kind of talk more about what the distilling market looks like at the end. So just kind of breezing through here, another crop that I mentioned a little bit earlier, winter camelina, maybe not as familiar to some of you. It's in the Brassica family. It's, related to canola and rapeseed, but it's a winter annual. So same as all of these other crops that I'm talking about, you plant it in the fall, it would come up in the spring, and it produces, flowers for pollinators. But, the main crop of what you're after is these small seeded oil seeds, and they are very small. You can see in the bottom right there, it's like 400,000 seeds per pound, but they're very high in oil content. So we're talking 36 to 40% oil, percentage, and decent yields too. So it's very drought tolerant. Camelina has been a crop, for thousands of years. It actually originated in Europe and has kind of come over to Canada and now into the US. There's spring seeded varieties and there's winter seeded varieties. And really what we're after is the winter seeded types that can yield, up to 1,500 pounds to sometimes even 2,000 pounds to the acre. And they mature super early too. So we're talking, in Minnesota, it's maturing and ready to be harvested by, mid to late June, which provides you a window for somebody to either do relay cropping, where you're planting soybeans into a crop like camelina, or double cropping, even in our shorter growing season. So in Iowa, you have the luxury of having just a little bit of a longer growing season to make that viable. for us in Minnesota, it's a pretty tight window. So that's what a lot of our breeding efforts have been focused on with a crop like Camelina, is just getting it up earlier, having it mature faster. So we're selecting for early maturing varieties. And this oil is highly desirable by all the big oil major companies because it has a very, very good carbon intensity score. So it's very low input. It's covering the ground during those really vulnerable periods, preventing nitrogen leaching, et cetera. So it looks really good from that standpoint. And that's what oil companies really want to do long term, is push down their carbon intensity to meet their own goals, and probably at some point to meet government regulations that will probably be on the horizon at some point. They're betting on that. It's not happened yet, but it might be coming. Camelina oil can also be used for human food as well, probably a smaller slice of the market there. The biggest uptake right now is pressing this for biodiesel uses. And camelina oil is a little unique in that it can also be used and refined for jet fuel, which some biodiesel products cannot be. So that makes it even more desirable as well from entities like Delta Airlines and the U.S. military as well, for the same reasons. It's resilient, and it's not making us reliant on imported fossil fuels. There's also an animal feed component, just like canola. That can be utilized as well after you press the oil. And like I mentioned earlier, our breeding efforts at the U are really focused on getting this crop matured, flowered, and up and harvested early, so we can follow up, like I mentioned, with a summer annual crop, just like we grow in the Midwest. Soybeans is a really great fit that you'd either plant into the established camelina, and then you'd harvest the camelina over the top, and then the soybeans come through. You could essentially get 2 harvestable crops in 1 year. That's really the goal of what we're trying to work towards and what we're trying to incentivize. Or somebody could do, kind of a double crop situation where they'd harvest the camelina and then follow it up with another crop after. Again, perennial living cover, providing those ecosystem services, but also providing, economic return on the back end for growers. And this variety is being trialed right now. It's on about 3 different farms and run 1 research station. So out of all of our development efforts, this one is on the horizon. It matures about a week earlier than kind of standard winter camelina that you'd see out in the marketplace, and hope to have that, commercialized and ready to roll out to growers in about 2 years or thereabouts. Other thing I should mention about camelina is because of its winter hardiness, it has a lot of uptake just as a cover crop too. So enterprising farmers and folks, that retail cover crop seed are very interested and have utilized camelina to really great effect, because it provides another option to plant really late. It's a very high seed count. So, seed is fairly cheap on a per pound basis. And it gives you another diversified option to throw out there for cover cropping as well, something other than rye, basically. So that really lends itself very well to kind of diversifying just a standard cover crop as well with a crop like camelina. And last one I will mention that's a little bit outside of the kind of the general crop type that we've been talking about so far, which is intermediate wheatgrass or kernza. And some of you may have heard that trade name kernza. That's just basically a trade name given to improved varieties of intermediate wheatgrass. Intermediate wheatgrass is native to Eurasia. It was brought over as a forage crop, maybe 100 years ago or so, and has been bred and selected over the last 30 to 40 years for larger seed size, better standability, better grain quality, all those agronomic traits that would make it, advantageous as a grain crop. But the real difference there is that it's a true perennial. Intermediate wheatgrass, if you plant it out west, it'll last for a decade. And similarly, with something like kernza, if you plant it, it's perennial cover. So meaning you don't have to replant it every single year, and it'll produce harvestable yield, both forage and grain, for multiple years. Typically you get about 3 years of maximum grain yield out of it. After that, it starts to decline just because the crop is established, and it's a perennial, so it thinks its job is done, right? It's covered the ground, it's done its job, it doesn't have to set as much seed. There's a lot of breeding and development efforts going on for kernza at the University of Minnesota, breeding for agronomic traits, larger seed size and reduced shattering. Also free threshing. So just like wheat is, we want naked grain out of the hull to kind of limit some of those issues there. But also overcoming sort of that yield decline that we've seen from kind of the early adoption as well. But it has a lot of beneficial uses, not only for livestock forage, which, intermediate wheatgrass is a great forage crop, but, that harvestable grain with that kernza grain can be turned into a lot of end use food products. So anything that you could make out of wheat, you can blend in kernza with just standard wheat and make crackers and bread and pasta. And so anything like that has seen a lot of uptake in the commercial space. You can go out and buy kernza products right now on Amazon. You can walk into Walmart and buy, kernza flour. Really, we're at a point where, that market awareness is there, and we're hoping and trying to juice up more consumer purchasing of this stuff to really pull that market forward, because it is pretty new for a lot of folks, both on the production end and on the consumer end. But it tells a very compelling story, again, kind of addressing the, ecosystem service components of a lot of these crops, but also providing, kind of a new and novel crop in the landscape. Biggest market recently is in the brewing industry. So people have, figured out how to use kernza as a brewing additive. And you can go out there. Patagonia just re-upped their program with about 24 breweries across the United States, and partnering to make kernza beer more widely available. And just a little bit about the life cycle of kernza, if you're not familiar. So you seed it in the fall, just like you'd fall seed alfalfa. It overwinters as kind of an established plant. And then the following, summer would be the first grain harvest year. If you spring plant it, it doesn't give you that first year of grain. So if you really want that first year of grain, you have to sow it in the fall, and it has to vernalize over the winter. And there's, not only, depending on the grain harvest, but you get to harvest straw, and straw in quotes. It's pretty high protein as straw goes. It's not like oat straw. And it gives you, both a spring and a fall window to graze or cut forage too. So we're talking multiple benefits, especially for folks that have livestock nearby or have their own animals. But kind of drilling back to that ecosystem service component, really, kernza really stands out as a really great tool to address nitrate pollution. So this is some research that was done across Minnesota, comparing nitrate leaching under different systems. And, kernza was essentially zero nitrate leaching compared to corn. And that was depending on a wide range of fertilization techniques. I think up to about 200 pounds to the acre was kind of the cap, which would be pretty exceptional even for corn ground. But, kernza takes it up and prevents that nitrogen from leaving the system. So for that reason, kernza has really great application, especially for areas that have really sensitive soils and sensitive drinking water leaching issues. So we're trying to, on the commercialization end, place kernza on these types of sensitive drinking water supply management areas in rural areas to really address nitrogen pollution. And similar story here, if you compare kernza to soybean, similar story across the entire growing season. So it's really providing that ecosystem service benefit writ large, but also providing harvestable, economic return to growers. And I'll just give you a quick blurb here about, where I'm coming from. So that water quality component is really key to kind of how we're framing our breeding and commercialization efforts. I'm funded from from a Minnesota Department of Ag program that's incentivizing planting, 4 of these crops out of our portfolio to address, water quality concerns across the state. And the program specifically is called ECO, or Economic and Environmental Clusters of Opportunity. So trying to incentivize folks to try these crops and also to plant them on, regions of the state that have impaired watersheds where these crops could do good. And how that works is we pay growers that enroll with an ecosystem service benefit from $20 to $40 an acre. I know I'm talking to an Iowa audience here. I wish this was a cross-border program too, but I'll kind of touch on, some other support programs that may be available for you all, in just a minute here. But so paying growers for those ecosystem services. And if your land is on a drinking water supply management area, you get a little bit of a premium there. So there's kind of an economic incentive there just to plant the crop. There's also an economic risk payment, essentially like crop insurance for each 4 of these crops too. So if they winter kill, or if they don't establish, or you harvest the crop and it's tricky to market it, you get up to half the cost of production back on the back end for folks. So it's kind of de-risking and incentivizing a production of these 4 crops across the landscape. And our goal is to get about 5,000 acres of these crops planted. And as of right now, I want to say we're at about 2,000. So there's room to grow there. But it's a compelling story, and one we're trying to continue to talk to growers about and also support professionals about. But I mean, that's one state initiative, and it's great. And we're so fortunate to have, the support of the state with our breeding and development efforts. But there's other types of programs that exist out there for growers. Now, some of them are easier to access than others, but there is support, say through, NRCS, EQIP. There's both cover crop payments and conservation crop rotation type payments available for folks that want to incorporate, things like winter annuals on their farm. They are a little bit preferential for new practices on the farm. So for folks that haven't planted these crops, that can be a good fit. But kind of the basic story there is to encourage people to go to their NRCS office fairly early on in the process. If you try to go after the crop is planted, you're not going to get selected. So you have to kind of plan ahead there. Sometimes even 6 to 8 months before you're even thinking about planting the crop. So you're making sure you're approved and, getting that all squared away so you can access the funding. There's CSP money and there's, nonprofits. For example, PFI, really big supporter of rotational, marketable rotational crops like small grains, also cover crops. They offer cost share dollars. And the sign up is right now for next season. I think the season is full, but that would be something to encourage folks to look into. Iowa Department of Ag has statewide cover crop cost share. There's Water Quality Initiative cost share. There's SWCD funding. With the Inflation Reduction Act, money is really being heavily invested in regenerative agriculture, and they really want outcomes, and they want people to use these types of programs. And historically, the uptake has been pretty limited. So, I mean, money is really not a limiting factor right now, which is surprising to say. It hasn't always been the case, but really we're at a point where that investment in regenerative agriculture and ecosystem outcomes is really huge right now. So would encourage anybody that's working with growers or wants to field questions like that to really push them to look into that, because at the end of the day, it's free money sitting out there to try some of these programs and to really see the benefit for themselves too. There's also private initiatives as well, carbon payments. I won't get too in the weeds on that because you have to kind of watch your step a little bit carefully there, but those dollars exist as well. Again, putting a financial value on ecosystem services is something that's going to continue to grow in agriculture. And a lot of it boils down to data, but still, we've been waiting for people to incentivize regenerative agricultural principles and really put a dollar value on all the good things that farmers are doing on the landscape. And we're kind of at that point right now, which is pretty exciting, but it's a lot to sort through. So definitely something to look into moving forward. And with that, I will bow out. I know I've taken up a little bit more than 25 minutes here, but I'll turn things back over to Matt, and then I think I'll answer some questions if there are any.
Yep, we definitely have some questions. So but kind of the logistical items, if you need a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW @iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, ALENAW @iastate.edu. Next slide, Matt. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographics survey, you can scan that QR code or go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. in iowalearningfarms.org/survey. If you submitted one for a 2023 webinar, thank you. You don't need to do it again. One time is enough in a calendar year. But if you're willing to do that, that would be great. And then we do have a webinar next week at 12 o'clock, even though the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I'll be giving that about some previous work I've done. So don't need to belabor that. Let's get to the questions. I guess one of the first ones is maybe an easy one. Are there fact sheets from the U on how a farmer can get started growing these crops?
Yes, great question. There are. So we have short 2-pagers on all of the crops in our portfolio located on our website. So if you email me with specific questions, some of them aren't very detailed about agronomic practices. We've kind of worked up separate sheets for that, but they're very public facing. So ones you could take to like a field day or, a trade show or something like that and kind of give people something to look at. But yeah, if you want more nuts and bolts agronomic information on any of these, I'm more than happy to provide that. But if you just kind of want like at a glance on any of the crops in our portfolio, if you go to our website, which is forevergreen.umn.edu, it's all kind of uploaded there. In addition to videos and webinars, and the website isn't super easy to navigate, but if you run into any trouble, just send me an email.
Okay. The next one is, can winter barley be aerial seeded? And if so, what rate?
It can. But really the trick with that is to get it up and established early enough where it's going to overwinter. Because even though, like a newer variety for us, like M and Equinox, has better winter hardiness than, the standard varieties that have been out there, we still do encourage folks to plant that fairly early. So it's up. No-till planting seems to work the best, and it tends to winter the best in years where there's lots of snow cover. If we have an open winter where it gets really blasted cold and there's not a lot of snow there, you can still get, winter kill on winter barley. So for most cereal grains, will it grow? Yeah, it will. But if you really are after, the grain on the back end, drilling it is going to give you the best results.
And what would be some of the kind of typical planting dates when you say early planting? Kind of, there was a question about what the typical planting dates for winter rye or wheat were as well.
Yeah. Yep. So planting dates for like something like hybrid rye, it pretty closely follows winter wheat planting recommendations. So, for us in Minnesota, that starts like early September, way in the north to like, end of September as you go into the far south. For Iowa, you're probably solid through mid-October, maybe even October 20th. Okay. That again, if we have years like this where it's 60 degrees for a week, you could probably push that planting date a little farther out. But yeah, I would say, before October 15th is probably ideal. Okay. Winter barley, we tend to want folks in Minnesota to plant before October if possible. So you probably get another, week to 2 weeks tacked onto the end of that.
Okay. I think you mentioned that winter rye, or maybe the winter hybrid rye, had higher production cost, and somebody asked why the higher production cost. Is that just the seed cost?
Yeah, seed cost is higher, at least 2x or 3x over what standard rye is worth. Okay. So that's part of it, but also it does require more fertility, and that can be a little confusing. We're talking about water quality and, nitrogen leaching reduction. Why are we going to put on more nitrogen? But I mean, the plant is there, it's up, it's utilizing the nitrogen that you're putting down. And a lot of the best practice recommendations for winter annuals are you spring apply it anyway. So you're putting on very limited amounts in the fall. You really want to target your fertilization for the spring before the plant starts heading and jointing. So for sure that nitrogen is staying in place. And roughly, the recommendations can change some, but kind of the standard rule of thumb is about 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel of hybrid rye. And at 80 to 100, bushel the acre, sometimes you can get higher than that, but that's a good average, that'll add up.
Okay. So this one, I'm taking my moderator prerogative to ask a question for me. So you talked about the winter or the rye and maybe the winter hybrid rye as a potential feed source, and that it's used quite a bit with pork production in the EU, I think.
Mhm.
Are there any advantages to it as a feed source over corn, maybe?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I'm not a
Yeah,
nutritionist, so I don't want to
I
walk.
know. I should have prefaced it by like this. This was probably outside your area of expertise, but I was just curious about it.
No, I mean that research work has been done. KWS, the breeding company, has sponsored
Okay.
research at University of Illinois. Did a big study on that with swine in particular, and yeah, I mean it has more complex fibers in the grain, so it keeps the animals satiated for longer. They often have less gastrointestinal issues
Okay.
with utilizing rye. They have less behavior issues if they're in confinement. They're not eating each other, or there's less by all kind of health metrics. It's increased. The one thing that it doesn't compete very well with corn is just that high throughput. If you want to get animals through the system, they eat less because they feel full, and then they grow a little bit slower than if they would with corn. Also with
Okay.
corn, there's an ocean of it in the United States. I mean, that's what we do very well, is produce corn. Um, but there's obviously an environmental component to that
Yeah.
as well. But yeah, people from a animal health standpoint, and also from a body carcass standpoint, there's a lot of advantages to
Okay.
feeding rye to animals.
And it's exciting to see like some of your yields there with the hybrid rye of over 100 bushel per acre, I think, if I
Mm-hmm.
remember correct. So,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, and that's that you can definitely achieve that on farm for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Um, there is a question here. Do you know how well some of these crops might do in southern Iowa? And it's hillier, warmer, wetter. Would we need to be concerned about more fungal disease problems in that type of climate?
With the cereal grains, not specifically. No, I
Okay.
mean you just your seasons are kind of a little bit different in that you're probably planting a little later and harvesting a little earlier. But yeah, I mean, incorporating winter annuals in the landscape becomes a lot easier the farther south you move. Like if you're in Indiana, Illinois, you just have that much wider of a window to get covers established and get them up, and so it becomes a trickier proposition as we go into Minnesota, where our growing seasons just are pretty short, and if you're growing corn, there's not a lot of time on either end to
Yeah.
really, take advantage of that available GDUs. But yeah, I mean, no concerns. For the biggest thing is probably just being aware of where your markets are, and how far you have to transport it. If you're talking about like a value added market like distilling or animal feed or wherever.
Yeah. That
And just trying it on a small parcel before you plant a quarter section of it
yeah.
or something.
Well, your snippet on the distiller brings up a question that somebody has. How easily can a farmer tap into selling their small grain to a distiller? Is it mainly a function of if there's a distiller nearby? And then I guess, how common is it for Midwest distillers to try to buy locally grown grains?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, the biggest market is Brooks Grain, and they're located in Indiana, and they kind of tap into the existing framework that's already there. So a lot, there's quite a few acres of hybrid rye grown in northern Minnesota, and they kind of aggregate it and load it on rail cars, and
Okay.
that makes it quite a bit worthwhile. So something to look into. They often have quality metrics that they want to meet. They want to make sure it's doesn't have mycotoxins in it, and has decent test weight, and is ergot free and stuff like that. So but definitely something to look into. There's other kind of players in that space as well that are buying at volume. But yeah, I mean, raising for kind of smaller scale or more locally oriented brewers, millers, distillers is a great potential market there. And probably if you're a little bit more entrepreneurial, you can get paid a much higher price for a relationship like that. But it takes more work on the farmer end, to kind of be
Yeah.
an entrepreneur and not just, haul your grain to an elevator and get paid.
Yeah. Uh, maybe kind of the last one in the interest of time, but there's one here. Maybe there are a couple more. But if winter cereals are part of the rotation, does volunteer rye present a weed issue in Kernza?
Specifically with Kernza, it can, yes.
Okay.
So any winter annual can compete with Kernza, and we had that happen. Actually, just this year, I went on a agricultural or agronomic call on a farmer with winter rye in their Kernza field, and not something you can, like Kernza eventually is a perennial, so it'll win in the long term. And depending on if you're conventional versus organic management, there's things you can do to kind of chop the rye back. That's probably your best technique, is just to go over the top
Okay.
and mow it off and give the Kernza another jump on it. So we've had that happen with other, even annual weeds too, that you can see it in a newly established Kernza field. And sometimes the Kernza field can look a little tough, but it comes back,
Okay.
once those weeds, even tricky weeds like, giant ragweed, can be given a run for their money by Kernza.
Okay. Cool. All right. Maybe this one, maybe the last one. Uh, you mentioned, that in a lot of these cases, money may not be the limiting factors, at least if there's some cost share dollars. But what would you say is the biggest factor preventing, maybe more broad scale adoption of some of the systems that you mentioned?
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. I mean, I'm sure it's multifaceted on the farmer end of things, but that's kind of where my focus is with farmers. But I think it's mainly proof in the marketing. There's always this chicken and egg question, and we deal with this a lot, kind of in the new and emerging crop space of like, farmers don't want to grow because there's not a market, and there's not a market because there's no supply, so it's
Yeah.
always kind of trying to thread the needle there of creating enough demand where there's a market there, because farmers are fairly pragmatic as a group. So if there's a market there for something, and they can fit it into their, existing production systems, they'll give it a shot. So it's markets, but it's also working with the established system is tricky, because if you're just planting corn and soybeans, or just only corn on corn on corn, doesn't give you a lot of diversity there to work with. So I think the biggest thing is also encouraging experimentation with diversity, even including a third crop or a second crop in their rotation, that provides those windows to get, other winter annuals planted by, September to October, or adjusting your, maturity dates on your corn and soybeans, so it comes off a little earlier, so you
Yep.
could have more of that growing season. So I think it's part of it is just working with the growers where they're at, and building the markets on the back end, but also, being willing to experiment, to kind of take advantage of those growing season times.
All right. All right, Matt, thanks. Thanks for an excellent presentation. Really, really interesting, important work. I'd encourage everybody to go look at their website. Um, and if you need a CCA CEU from the Learning Farms webinar, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Feel free to tune in next week or future webinars. You don't have to worry about next week necessarily. I'm giving it, so you might not want to listen to me, but tune in the future. Again, sorry for the inconvenience of switching over to the Zoom webinar platform. We'll make sure all those links are consistent in the future. With that, thank you again, Matt, for an excellent talk, and look forward to seeing more about this work in the future.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Take
Okay.
care.
All right. Take care.